So it's my pleasure today to introduce Beth Summerfield with Anthrotech. Beth makes complex digital services accessible, concise, understandable, and polished. She believes effective digital experiences, whether it's an app, a project proposal, or an interactive data visualization, are derived from understanding audiences, setting focused business goals, designing for inclusion, and building strong communication with diverse stakeholders. As a digital accessibility analyst at Anthrotech, Beth works to make it easier for all people to be connected and to get the things they need. And I know accessibility is something that we encounter a lot, at least out in California where my company is. And so that's why I'm thrilled to have her here today to talk about getting started with digital accessibility. With that, take it away.
Hi, it's good to be here. Welcome. So I am going to kick on some subtitles and get the show going here. Let me know if they are working. Oh, if they are not working for you. So I want to tell you a bit about digital accessibility. And so in this session, I want to explain WCAG standards and outline steps to begin incorporating accessibility strategy into your design and development processes. So overview of what I'm doing here. I'm going to talk about what is digital accessibility. I'm going to talk about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. And then I'm going to talk about working toward and beyond compliance. So just to be clear, this is guidance for beginners. When we start an accessibility project, I get a lot of people asking, why are businesses and government agencies getting sued and losing? And what is WCAG? But I get even more who have just enough knowledge to make compliance promises that they can't keep. Designers often assuming that their only role is to check color contrast. Developers who are committing to create WCAG 2.2 AAA compliant applications, or saying that an overlay is going to be able to be added in post-production that will solve all of the accessibility problems. So this presentation is to get the basics on what digital accessibility is, what WCAG does, and some first steps toward adding accessibility to your process. I know everyone has a different learning style, so I want to stop along the way to answer questions and delve into some details. I'd love to have some conversation, even if it means the presentation doesn't quite stick to the slides. So what is digital accessibility? You're here because you've heard about lawsuits, you've heard about policy and compliance like the Americans with Disabilities Act or Section 508 if you work with the federal government. You've heard about WCAG compliance, or maybe you had a family member or a friend who uses assistive technology or has a temporary injury, and they've asked for help to use a website, or you had a friend or family member complain about a form that was difficult to see or understand or use. When I talk about digital accessibility, I'm going to talk about what it means to be inclusive. Assistive technology to consider as you design and code your site, and principles that can help you think, design, and code more accessibly. In talking about principles, I'll start digging into WCAG, what it is and how it works. So what does it mean to be inclusive? It's important to consider that 1 in 5 Americans has a disability. This is a huge and diverse segment of your audience. So designing for accessibility means being inclusive of a wide range of disabilities. We're talking about visual, auditory, physical, speech, cognitive, language, learning, neurological. There's a lot of different kinds of disabilities that we're talking about when we're talking about inclusion. When we do inclusive usability studies at Anthrotech, people often ask for participants with permanent vision loss who are skilled with screen readers or screen magnification, or people with physical disabilities who navigate with voice or keyboard instead of using a mouse. For studies with interactive or video components, people often consider participants with hearing loss who require subtitles or sound descriptions. That work is key, and usability studies with assistive technology are an important part of inclusivity, and I'm going to come back to that later. But first, I just want to sort of look at consider the bigger umbrella of inclusion, where we consider people who aren't highly technically skilled with their assistive technology. We consider that sometimes what we sometimes call hidden disabilities, like color blindness, a very common challenge in visual design, or anxiety or depression that can impact focus and information and visual processing, or dyslexia, ADHD, and other learning disabilities that can impact reading and information processing. Consider also situational disabilities like temporary hearing loss, which goes back to someone who may not have or be skilled with assistive technology, or a temporary broken arm, or other limited mobility or movement, or lack of visual mental focus from situational stress, which we all know about right now, right? Or a migraine. So what I've got here on the screen is a picture from the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit. And I'm highlighting that because it's a great resource that can expand your thinking on inclusion to be really inclusive. And the picture shows little icons representing people, including a range of activities, ages, and assistive technologies. They're there to remind you that accessibility has a lot of different faces. There's even a wide variety of assistive technologies to consider. So assistive technologies can include screen readers, eye tracking, keyboard navigation, screen magnification, font and color customizations, a sip and puff device, tactile displays and peripherals, and speak recognition and captioning. So what tools and resources do we have to make sure that the stuff we design and the stuff that we build works for our broad array of users? So a really big piece of that is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And you've probably heard of WCAG, or even that a website is WCAG 2.0 AA compliant. What does that mean, and how does it support digital accessibility? WCAG is an international standard for digital accessibility. In its own words, it defines how to make web content more accessible to people with disabilities. Its goal is to create actionable, measurable guidance that designers and developers can use to know that they are implementing accessible websites and applications. So I'm not going to walk you through every guideline. I've been to that class, and it took like 2-hour sessions for multiple days just to skim the surface. So what I'm going to give you is a high-level review of the principles and some of the guidelines, and point you to where and how you can dig deeper to support that work. WCAG principles can be really useful to guide your work. The guidelines, success criteria, and techniques provide you a toolbox and a reminder of what accessibility can look like and what it should look like, that actionable goal I just mentioned. Because WCAG was built to be measurable, it can also provide a standard for holding your team accountable. So it has a lot of different elements sort of baked into it. So how does WCAG work? What did I mean when I said principles, guidelines, success criteria, and techniques? So the visual on this page shows the hierarchy. It's a screenshot that shows how principles, guidelines, success criteria, and techniques nest beneath each other. So in WCAG, there are 4 principles, and they provide the foundation. There are 13 guidelines that live underneath those principles. And there are 70 success criteria, these testable criteria that help you assess whether you're meeting the guidelines. And then there are sufficient and advisory techniques, ways that you can accomplish be successful and meet the success criteria. They're not the only ways you can meet those criteria, they're just the ways that are recommended to work. So that's something to consider, is that they don't say, this is the only way you can do it. These are sufficient advisory techniques that you could be using to be assured that you're building something that's accessible. So let me dig a little more into how that works with an example. The first of the 4 principles is, principle 1 is perceivable. Information and user interface components must be presented to users in a way they can perceive. The first guideline under the principle, guideline 1.1, text alternative, is to provide a text alternative for any non-text content so that it can be changed into other forms people need. So that's just one of the guidelines that ladders up to that perceivable concept. It's saying that there has to be a text alternative if you're presenting something that isn't text. So if people can't perceive something that isn't text, they have text that allows them to perceive it. So the first criteria under that guideline is, the first way you know you've met that guideline is 1.1.1 non-text content, and that's a level A. So all non-text content that is presented to the user has a text alternative that serves the equivalent purpose. So I'm going to talk about that level A thing in a second, because that's really important. But first, I just wanted to sort of explain how that laddering works and sort of help you understand that. And finally, the technique. So in order to meet that success criteria that non-text content has a text alternative, you can provide a short text alternative. So for non-text content that serves the same purpose and presents the same information as the non-text content. So that's like an alt tag on your image. And this seems like pretty basic, but I use this one as example, not just because it's the first one, but also because it's one of the most common things that is an accessibility barrier that people aren't fixing on their website, is just making sure that there's alternative text for things that are not text-based. So the very specific and measurable guidance supports each principle. So this simple example, that first principle, gives you a sense of how this structure works. So how do you use it? Unless you are actively auditing, most people don't memorize every single criteria, maybe the guidelines, but not every single criteria, and certainly not every single technique. It's a reference resource. You look at the guidelines to guide your ideas as you design and implement. You look at the success criteria or techniques to guide your problem solving. And you critique your work by assessing whether it meets the success criteria. Before I go any further, are there any sort of questions about that hierarchy or the nitty-gritty of that before I dig a little further into those principles and how you can apply them? I don't see anything, so I'll just keep going. Hopefully, if there's anyone who has anything, you can put it into the chat. So I'm going to focus on the principles. They can help you think, design, and code more accessible. They are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So they serve as this powerful framework for understanding how your website and app work if it's going to be accessible. The key is to keep these principles in mind as you work and use the guidelines, success criteria, and techniques as reference. So my colleague Atulia designed these fun little graphics to help visual thinkers like me trap these principles into our brains so that we have them as a reference as we work. So the graphic on this slide is styled text that read, what does this image sound like? And that is there to remind us of the first principle, perceivable. It can't be invisible to all of a user's senses. For example, a person using a screen reader, images needs a text alternative. For a person who is deaf, videos need captioning to exist in their perception. They have to need these alternatives in order to be perceived. A quick and productive test. Navigate through your website and app using the tab key. If there are fields or links that the key skipped entirely, they don't even exist to someone who's navigating with a keyboard or using a screen reader. So there's a lot of little tricks like that, but that's just one example of how to test for perceivable. So the next little graphic that Atulia made is a drawing of a computer mouse with the text, on vacation, contact keyboard for immediate attention. And that's basically going into the principle of operable. It can't require interaction that a user can't perform. So an example of this is for a person using a mouse or a touch screen with limited fine motor control, like someone with a hand tremor or my young daughter or my aging dad. Operating a mouse works, but only with big buttons and big targets. Everyone has to be able to operate the thing that you build. Things to watch out for in that one: it doesn't work unless you type something, the thing that you built doesn't work unless you type something exactly right. Or it's really easy to click on the wrong button, or it's difficult to click on the right button. Those are usually red flags that if these are becoming challenges, then you need to consider that your system isn't operable and you need to start doing these checks for accessibility and seeing if you need to fix things. So this one is drawing, it's a little drawing of an anthropomorphized brain looking through an eyeball with confusion in a maze. And this is trying to remind you of this idea of the third principle, which is understandable. Both the information and how the system operates have to make sense. So an example of this one is for a person who has short-term memory loss or is under significant stress. A website will be more understandable if the design is consistent, if it's not visually cluttered. And the text should be written in plain language and broken into digestible chunks that lend themselves to scanning. So that understandable element is about the content itself making sense, and then the way the content is organized and how we interact with it also need to be understandable. In my project work, when I hear a client saying, it didn't work because they didn't follow the directions, or there's a steep learning curve and then they'll get it, or we need to write down more descriptions to tell people what to do, those are usually the red flags to me that I need to keep an eye on this principle. That if we're needing to give them more directions, if there's a difficult learning curve, that this is going to be even more burdensome for some of your users, right? So finally, the fourth principle is represented by a happy little robot saying, I can work with this. And this is the principle, the fourth principle is robust. And this is one that a lot of people take a while to really digest. But the idea is, especially design-focused people, but the idea is code and content is well formatted to be easily parsed by a range of technologies. So an example of this is for a person using a screen reader or a bot program to find web content. Headings and subheadings that are properly tagged in HTML give that information structure. So a phrase I hear accessibility champions say a lot is programmatically determined. And in essence, that just means good code. Does the structure of the code support the content? Things like HTML that is well formatted and clearly labeled so that it is understandable without having to see it through the design on the page. And again, this is one that's a frequent issue on websites, is that what you see is not necessarily what is coded into the background. There's a lot of duct tape on there to get it to look the way you want it to look. So there's a few common WCAG questions that I get. And one is, should I work toward A, AA, or AAA compliance? And often we'll have people that we work with say, well, we want it to be AAA because that's the best one. More is better, right? So the way it really works is A is must. They're non-negotiable big deal things. And this is like the bare minimum. AA is should. You should do these things. For real, they're important, and AA conformance requires A and AA to be met. So this is like the standard that we often see, is that something needs to be AA. AAA is may, and these are guidelines to follow, but are at times inappropriate or can't be implemented for what you're doing. So the conformance level recommendation that's baked right into WCAG is, it's not possible to satisfy level AAA success criteria for some content. So you strive, my approach tends to be AA is the baseline, and then you look at the AAA and see whether it applies to your situation. And if it does, then you strive to achieve it. So this for me is one of the indicators that's a red flag. If a developer or vendor tells me that their product is 100% AAA compliant, it usually makes me skeptical, because it often means that they don't actually know what they're saying. Not always, but that's sort of a little red flag. So another common question I get is, should I work toward 2.0 or 2.1 or now 2.2? And I'm seeing a question here. The industries have been sued, and I think this is going to touch on that. So the numbers are a progression. They're backwards compatible. So the release date of WCAG 2.0 was published in December of 2008. 2.1 was released in June of 2018, and 2.2 is slated, I believe, to be released this spring. It's been bumped back a couple times. So what's the difference between 2.0 and 2.1? There's one new guideline. There's 17 new success criteria. From 2.1 to 2.2, it's a much smaller change, but some pretty important stuff. But there are no new guidelines, and there are 9 new success criteria. So it's not a huge leap, and it's not that big a burden to stretch from 2.1 to 2.2. But there's some significant things like focus, appearance, and authentication that are really good to shoot for. So something to consider, because there is that big gap between 2.0 and 2.1. This is 2008. We were using tables for layout. All our buttons were images with text that couldn't be scaled for different size screens. Design systems weren't a thing. Layout was not responsive. So these screenshots on the screen here of Amazon and a couple other websites really show that there's a lot has happened since 2008. So when you're looking at 2.0 compliance, you're looking at a world that has really changed. There weren't APIs. Just so many things were manual. So realistically, if you're really trying to create something that's accessible in the current climate, you're going to want to use the most current 2.1, 2.2. So that would put you at 2.1 AA with some AAA things in there if you want to, or 2.2 AAA ideally, or AA, sorry, ideally. So that said, what does the law say? Much of the law is rooted in 2.0 AA. Although it is increasingly shifting to 2.1, some of the really big ones, like the Americans with Disabilities Act, the federal government Section 501, a lot of state and local laws like Washington and California and New York, although Washington actually is working for Washington State is doing 2.1 now. And that's working on applications for the state itself, not all of Washington State. And then there's specific accessibility guidance around the airline and travel industry, and especially the education industry. And those ones are all rooted in 2.1 and working their way toward improving. So that's sort of the baseline of how those laws were created. And the decision making is sort of rooted in that. However, some of the lawsuits that have come out have expected a higher bar than that. So it's worth recognizing that while like the ADA is rooted in 2.0 AA, getting above that bar is something that you're really going to want to consider. Just checking the notes here to see if I missed anything. Looks like there's a side conversation, but that's great. So the next common question I get is, if my website is WCAG compliant, it's totally accessible, right? Not necessarily. there's a little saying, it's a little like saying, if I obey all the laws, I'm totally a good person, right? Your website is most likely better than it would have been, but there's some complexity to that. First, it's a rare site that's 100% compliant. It's even a more rare one that stays like that. Secondly, compliance is comprised only of the things that can be measured. Many accessibility issues are difficult to wrap in requirements, and others are more subjective. So sometimes a design that works well for one person poses challenges for another. So what do? As you work toward compliance, support it with a culture of accessibility. And before I dig into that whole cultural roots, I just want to know if anyone has any more questions. And I'm seeing one pop up here. I see, when pushing to offer more and better accessibility clients, what training should a web shop consider and who should take it? So there's a bunch of different ways to approach that. And for me, you're probably going to hear, take all the training and everyone should take it. But of course, that I understand that that's not realistic, and that's the response I very often get. But I'll talk a little bit as we move forward about some tools that everybody can use. And from a training standpoint, there's a lot of decent training out there that you can use, like the DQ training or getting a trainer in to work with your staff individually, which is work that my company often does. So it sort of depends on what level you're trying to dig into. Since I framed this around a starting point, I think a really good starting point is just getting to know WCAG and understand it better, because knowing those principles and getting a better sense of how they can be applied to your work is just sort of the basic starting place where you can raise your awareness and change the way that you design and change the way that you code. And then I have, can you give any recommendations for accessibility auditing tools? Yes, but I'm going to do that later. So I think you just served as a segue for me to move on to the next slides. And I'm also going to answer some questions later on. So if I missed any of them, don't worry, I can come back around to those. So working toward and beyond compliance. It's about making accessibility part of your process. So I put an image up here of the stages of the user-centered design process, because that's what we use at AnthroTech. And there are opportunities to bake in accessibility in any of these stages, in the discovery and research, in design and development, as you evaluate and evolve, and then as you launch your product. So what does that look like? For us, shifting left is a theme that you'll hear frequently in the accessibility community. It's easier and less resource intensive to plan and consider accessibility the earlier you are in the process. So often I hear accessibility framed as a development issue, something to catch in QA or address post-launch with some sort of overlay. After a vocal customer speaks up. If you bring accessibility into discovery and research, and then bake it into the design and development and evaluation, you'll find that those later steps are not as necessary, and you're not going to need to rebuild things or try to make an overlay work, and they don't. So what can that look like? One thing that we do is during discovery and research, we include accessibility in our personas. So personas allow you to make accessibility part of your process rather than adding it on. It reminds your team that accessibility is diverse and complex, and sometimes even contradictory, and brings tough decisions up earlier in the process. And we see this again and again, where if you're using these personas, some of the solutions that you come up with early in your problem solving are stop. before they even get a chance to create problems that you'll have later. And some of the way that you build things will be, it'll be baked in, right? I think I'll keep saying that phrase over and over. But especially in agile development environments, it keeps the team focused on the whole picture of what their users need and the user limitations as well. During design and development, baking accessibility into your design system. So many of the reasons that you want and have a design system in the first place are really intertwined with accessibility. And I've got some screenshots here of some really simple images and examples of button states from a design system that show 3 different states of a button and have descriptive text explaining the button and the button behavior, and include why the accessibility is an important element of that button behavior. So it's easy to include accessibility in the visual and narrative elements of your design system, like defining the focus states or including the why in the narrative. It's a great opportunity for designers to annotate. So use consistent patterns for labeling and describing interactions so that developers have a clear picture of what accessibility looks like and how they're supposed to interact. Just put in annotations to define those interactions, and you're not leaving any mysteries up in the air around accessibility. And then a huge part of accessibility is consistency. So consistency is one of the major reasons for having a design system, right? So consistent and predictable patterns are easier to understand and reduce cognitive load. So they're really key to helping with a range of disabilities, whether it's cognitive or vision or, and supporting a range of assistive technology. So being ready, it also allows you to be ready for change. That WCAG update I mentioned earlier, you'll be more prepared to accommodate change if you're really baking these into your designs. So from a development angle, one of the most basic and key things you can do is just know and use HTML basics. And one of the things that I've seen repeatedly working with developers is that knowing and using HTML is kind of like a basic thing that isn't really what you did in school and isn't really a focus of what the fun part of development is, right? And this applies to designers as well. Having a really solid knowledge of HTML semantic structure means that you create code that is more accessible, and that really hits that robust, but also some of the other elements. So having your page structured with regions, headers, footers, structured navigation in the code, having the content structured. So having headings that are in the code, having buttons and link labels that are meaningful without explanation or context, like click here. Using color well is part of that content structure. Don't use only color to convey meaning. Really properly coding links and buttons. Use them right, label them, and give them consistent states. When you're looking at forms, that's one of the areas that really provides challenges. If you don't properly code your HTML forms, they're not going to work for a lot of assistive technologies. They have to have labels. They have to make sure the labels are associated with the fields, make sure that required fields are also labeled in the code, and make sure that your tab order is consistent and that it's linear. And finally, tables. And I'm just throwing that one in there because it's, again, one of these really, really basic things that many, many websites get really wrong. So, excuse me. Tables are not for layout, they're for data. And well-labeled tables, labeling the rows and labeling the column row headings and the column headings are really key for them to be understandable for people who are not processing using a visual screen. The other area that's really important to know is how to use ARIA. And I've which is the accessible rich internet applications, although I'm not sure I've ever heard anyone actually say that all the way out. And it's a framework to improve the accessibility and interoperability of web content and applications. So I have a little image in here that's just a screenshot of some ARIA code. But what it basically is extra code that can be added to provide support for accessibility that's not currently available in HTML. And many of the features from ARIA are gradually rolled into HTML. It's sort of that, it's the front guard that HTML can follow after. And this is what coders will use to make a design accessible if the design isn't something that's straight out of the box HTML. Developers with just a little knowledge of ARIA often use it as a crutch, and it does not work. So that is something to really keep in mind. For designers, digging through ARIA specifications and understanding what they can do, this can really help you create designs that can be implemented accessibly, like understanding HTML and knowing what comes out of the box and really leveraging that stuff is valuable. Understanding ARIA lets you know what is possible and whether or not it can be implemented. That said, right in the main body of the descriptions of ARIA, the first principle is if you can use a native HTML element or attribute that's already built in, then do so. No ARIA is better than bad ARIA. And that is something really, really important. And that also sort of flips over to the design side of things. If you can design for your developers in a way that they can use native HTML elements and attributes, then do so. Because if you're slapping in ARIA at the end, there's a really good chance that you're making it worse for people. So earlier there was a question about testing tools, and that is also a part of design and development. And there's a really decent selection of free and low-cost accessibility testing tools that provide automated and guided accessibility tests that your developers and content managers could be using as they go. So a couple of these tools, I have the little icons here on the screen, and DQ's Axe and Microsoft's Accessibility Insights are two of the really big players in this field that offer free tools. There's a bunch more. There's little things for specific tasks like the Paciello Group's Color Contrast Analyzer or Funkify and No Copy that are plugins that deal with color contrast. And there are other tools. I think I saw a couple in the comments thread that will test for accessibility. But these Axe and Accessibility Insights are really good ones to start out with, just to look at your work and see whether or not it's raising any flags that you didn't notice. And it's really good for your content people to use to make sure that they are remembering to add alt tags, remembering to consider color contrast. They're both just, and the guided aspect of them helps you look for things that you may have forgotten or may not be front of mind as you're developing. So these tools are really usable for a broad audience, and it allows you to spot review your work as you go and lets you catch potential issues before they become really difficult ones. So it's sort of a part of your development cycle and part of your content development cycle is to use these tools and catch the little things so that you don't have to do it all at the end and potentially have to rework something that's really deeply embedded in your system. And then in the evaluation stage, there's inclusive usability studies. And like with all studies, they're great for getting firsthand experience from users and for seeing your design, having someone see your designs and your product through fresh eyes or ears with real users. Another layer that accessibility studies offer is you're finding issues that can't be simulated. You're getting user insight to help solve design challenges when they come up. You get to see how they're not working and why, and learn about how different disabilities clash, and work through the tricky dance of figuring out how to solve those design challenges. You're also looking beyond compliance to see where the things that the standards aren't able to test for, and really get to know people's lived experiences. And finally, you're looking to build stakeholder buy-in with qualitative and quantitative data. And that's something that we've seen over and over again in our studies, that having powerful evidence for your stakeholders when they're pursuing an inaccessible idea is really, really valuable in fighting for accessibility when you may have people that you're working for or working with that have an idea that's not accessible that they're really, really loving. So a phrase that just sticks with me and I feel like is a great thing to end on is nothing about me without me. And that comes a slogan that is believed to have originated from the South African disability movement, although it's been attributed to a lot of places, but that's really where accessible usability studies come in, is doing usability studies really brings users into the process and helps helps your product to become something that has a deeper kind of accessibility. Questions?
Hi, I'm going to pop back on here real quick. I've been keeping tabs of some of the questions from before, and we'll also have folks put their questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to keep track of those for you. So Mike Lorman asked, if a client comes to you because they heard others in their industry have been sued because their site is not being accessible, what level should you shoot for? And I'm just going to tack something onto that, like, and what else should you do?
Yeah, that's a complicated question. A lot of the law, as I said earlier, is rooted in WCAG 2.0 AA, but there have been some cases that have pushed into 2.1 AA territory. So that's not, there isn't sort of a get out of jail free card that you can get that will make your system accessible. Typically when people come to us saying other people have been sued, what do we have to strive for? We're going to recommend 2.1 AA or pretty soon 2.2, but also just recommend some process changes that make it so that it's not just a compliance thing that you're striving for. It's changing your culture so that you are aware of accessibility and are able to create something accessible because you want to.
Okay, great. Let's see here. Another question came in. Our SEO consultant suggested adding tags to everything for SEO purposes. Do you think it's bad to add tags to design-only elements? And there was a little bit of chatter over on the side that you might have seen about that. So, what's your take on that?
There's a lot of really cool connections between SEO and accessibility. But I'm not, I wish I want to go through the chat here and figure out exactly what you're talking about. Because too much tagging can create sort of an over presence of information, right? And that's sort of counterproductive. But doing the kind of tagging that makes search engines, so that's a tough one. Yeah. I mean, in general, yes, the tagging is a good idea, but it has to be something that is robust, that is machine readable and understandable. So if they're telling you to like over tag everything, and then you might want to take a step back and say, tagging is really good, but only if it actually gets you toward a specific goal.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, this is from Josh Broadlight. He says, we've been having a lot of success leveraging web accessibility as an upsell for our web projects. More recently, we've had some clients move to cheaper alternatives like plug and play embeddable tools, Accessibility. Are these tools legit? Do you see these taking over the market for ADA development? And I know you kind of went through some other tools, but I think this is sort of a different, different take on that.
So, I have not seen pluggable tools that provide overlays over your site actually achieve accessibility in a meaningful way. A big part of that nothing about me without me chunk is that machines generated code changes are not going to catch everything that's an issue. Being compliant is not necessarily going to catch everything that's an issue. So that human element of testing and ensuring that the tab orders are working, that labels are working. There are things that an overlay simply isn't able to do at this point. And because of that, often the overlays will add things in that are detrimental, that make it harder for people to use something. So they've become very popular, but I have yet to see one, and I have yet to hear anything from my peers in accessibility that say, yeah, this overlay is magically fixing everything. So there's some great articles running around. I wish I had them on me, but you could probably Google accessibility and lawsuits and come up with them, where some of the overlays, people have done research and found some challenges with those at this point. I mean, the technology, it just may not be quite there yet.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Thanks for that. I think that's something that we're all encountering a lot of. Some of our clients actually found those on their own. And so, yeah, that's really great to have that guidance.
Ours too. Yeah. I've seen people saying, hey, why don't we just put accessibility on at the end? And I think,
yeah,
you can try, but it's better to bake it into your process. And then, with confidence from the beginning that real people can use your site or your application.
Okay, I have another question from Doug Black, and he says you had mentioned how depression and anxiety plays a piece in creating accessible sites. Can you give an example or two of how this impacts the user?
Yeah, it's a complicated one because different people experience different things. So cognitive disability and cognitive issues are not addressed as well in WCAG as a lot of the other things that are much more easily defined. But that said, there's some research that movement and overwhelming visual experience can increase cognitive load, or things that are complicated to read and processes that are complicated to understand can increase cognitive load, and that can be impactful for people with anxiety and depression. So thinking about things like unnecessary scrolling and background movement and unrelated actions happening in different places, which also impacts people with now I'm like blanking in the middle of talking about cognitive. With motion sickness, those kinds of things overlap with anxiety and depression. Okay, but that's an area that's really growing right now, and there's a lot of research happening because it's an area where we don't have a ton of knowledge and have even less guidance.
That's great. I think that's really fascinating and also really important. So I actually didn't see, I've been kind of keeping an eye on the questions, and I think I caught most of them. I think at this point, what we can do is I just want to say, I first got introduced, I should have said this at the beginning, I first got introduced to Anthrotech because actually one of Beth's colleagues had reached out to us to jointly work on a project proposal where we would do development and you would do accessibility. And I think that that's something that is probably, I mean, you'll find a lot of development agencies and developers here that would be great to chat with. And I think if you're interested in going to a session after this, we can pick up the Q&A and kind of a less formal setup, and people can actually come in and share their own screens and mics and everything.
Sure.
And so, yeah, I think that I mean, was there anything else you'd like to add, Beth?
No, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And
thank you so much for coming. This was a really, really illuminating talk and something I think we all need to learn more of. So thanks so much.